General Hospital spoilers reveal that it began with a whisper, not a scream, not a confession under bright lights, but a cold and trembling whisper that echoed through the sterile silence of General Hospital. Britt Westbourne, long burdened by secrets she had no right to carry, finally surrendered to the truth she could no longer bear. Her hands trembled as she spoke, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to do. In a single breath, she exposed Drew Kane's darkest secret, one that had been carefully concealed beneath layers of charm, authority, and the illusion of moral righteousness. And with those few words, everything shifted. The truth didn't simply break the surface, it detonated, unleashing a shockwave that tore through every relationship, every bond, every lie that had held the fragile piece of Port Charles together. For Willow Corinthos, the impact was immediate and shattering. She had clung to Drew with a desperation that blinded her, trusting in him not only as a protector but as the moral compass she believed Michael had lost. She had defended Drew against whispers, against intuition, against the aching doubts in her own chest. And now, all of that devotion, every justification, every late-night reassurance she gave herself, turned to dust. The truth Britt revealed wasn't just about Drew's manipulation. It was about the entire foundation Willow had built her second life upon. Drew hadn't merely deceived others, he had controlled her, isolated her from those who once loved her, and used her vulnerability as a weapon in his twisted pursuit of influence and power. The days that followed were a haze for Willow. She wandered through her world like a ghost, unable to sleep, unable to eat, plagued by the realization that her choices, her alliance with Drew, her decision to fight Michael in court, her coldness toward Carly, her silence toward Jason, had left her utterly alone. The image of her children slipping away from her in that courtroom replayed in her mind endlessly. She had thought she was protecting them. Now she understood she had merely been surrendering them to a war she never fully understood. And as her world collapsed, so too did her defenses. She broke down alone, behind closed doors, shaking and sobbing into pillows that could not answer, with only the ghosts of her mistakes to comfort her. The silence was the cruelest part. From Michael, there was nothing. No call, no message. Not even a glance of concern. She had burned that bridge too thoroughly, and she knew it. And yet, despite everything, her thoughts drifted back to him. To the way he used to hold her hand in the middle of the night when the pain from her illness became unbearable. To the way he looked at Wiley with pride. To the way they used to laugh when Amelia was first learning to crawl. She remembered it all now, not as a fantasy, but as a cruel reminder of what she had lost. And yet, inside the grief, something stirred. A voice, quiet but insistent, that told her it wasn't too late. That maybe, just maybe, if she humbled herself, if she bared her soul and asked not for forgiveness but for help, there might still be a path back. It was pride that had kept her away. Pride, and fear. But now she had neither. She was stripped bare. And so, one rainy afternoon, barely able to hold herself together, Willow found herself standing outside the Corinthos estate. Her hands trembled as she lifted them to knock, her heart pounding with the rhythm of regret. The door opened, and there he was. Michael. Older somehow, colder, but still carrying that same quiet strength she had once fallen in love with. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her. His expression unreadable. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Only tears. They stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity before he finally stepped aside, wordlessly letting her in. The room was filled with memories. Photos of the children, traces of a life that had once included her but now felt like a stranger's home. She sank into the edge of the couch, clutching the hem of her sweater, trying to find the courage to speak. And when she did, it wasn't an apology. It wasn't a justification. It was a plea. "I don't know how I got here," she whispered. "But I know I can't fix it alone." Michael didn't rush to embrace her. He didn't reassure her. He simply sat across from her, arms crossed, eyes searching. He had been through his own hell, betrayed, vilified, dragged into a legal battle for his own children, and yet, somewhere in the silence between them, something else stirred. A shared pain. A familiar ache. The kind that only those who once loved each other with everything could truly understand. Willow told him everything. About Drew. About how she had been manipulated. About Britt's revelation. About how the pieces of her mind had started to fall apart weeks ago, and she hadn't even realized it. She told him about the nightmares, the guilt. The voices that whispered she had become a mother unworthy of her children. And through it all, Michael listened. Not as a judge. Not as an ex. But as someone who, deep down, still remembered the woman he once believed in. Days turned to weeks. Willow didn't return to Drew. Instead, she returned to herself. Therapy sessions. Time with Wiley and Amelia. Under supervised visits that slowly became longer and more intimate. She didn't ask Michael for anything. She only showed up, to school events, to doctor appointments. To quiet moments on the porch when the children were asleep. She was there. Present. Vulnerable. And slowly, Michael began to soften. He saw the change. Not the desperate woman who had lashed out in fear, but the mother who was rebuilding her soul brick by brick. Meanwhile, Drew's empire crumbled. Public trust eroded. Nina distanced herself. Jason returned, more protective of Michael than ever, and publicly condemned Drew's manipulation. Carly, though still bruised by Willow's past betrayal, admitted to Michael that she saw the effort Willow was making. Even Sasha, graceful and honest, gently stepped back, telling Michael that if he still had feelings for Willow, he needed to find that answer without guilt or obligation. And so, in the quiet aftermath of chaos, Michael and Willow began something new. Not a romantic reunion forged in passion, but a cautious rebuilding rooted in truth. They took walks through the park with the kids. Shared silent breakfasts. Slowly rediscovered laughter. And one night, as a soft breeze drifted through the window, and Amelia lay asleep on Michael's chest, Willow looked at him and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." He didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. Not a forced, polite smile, but one of recognition. Of something broken finding its way to healing. Port Charles would never forget the damage Drew caused. But in the ruins he left behind, something unexpected had bloomed. A second chance. A fragile reconciliation. A new beginning. Everything was changing, not in slow, subtle ways, but in sharp, blistering jolts that sent tremors through every relationship in Port Charles. Willow Corinthos, once quiet, pliable, and tragically loyal, was no longer the woman who stood silently beside Drew Kane in courtrooms and hospital wings. Something inside her had snapped. Or more accurately, awakened. In the wake of Britt Westbourne's damning revelation, which exposed Drew's deep-rooted manipulation and deceit, Willow's world had not merely shifted, it had detonated. The man she had once trusted above all else, the man who held her hand and whispered about building a future, had been constructing something entirely different behind her back: control. Power. A future that didn't include her voice, only her submission. But she wasn't silent anymore. In the days following Britt's confession, Willow made her first public move. Not with words, but with actions. She returned to work at the hospital, not out of necessity, but as a statement. She was reclaiming her life. Colleagues who once pitted her now watched with cautious admiration. Her posture had changed. Her tone was firm. She no longer smiled just to smooth over tension. She asked questions. She challenged protocols. And when someone brought up Drew's name in the break room with a nervous chuckle, she didn't flinch. She simply turned and said, "That man doesn't speak for me anymore," before walking away. Outside the hospital, Willow began repairing the bridges she had once scorched. Her first visit was to Carly. It was tense, the air between them heavy with unspoken history, but Willow didn't come to beg. She came to acknowledge. She stood in Carly's kitchen and said, "I believed the wrong person. And I hurt the right ones. I can't change that. But I can own it." Carly, sharp as ever, stared at her long and hard before replying, "Then do better. For the kids. For Michael. For yourself." There was no hug. No tears. But when Willow left, she felt something shift. Not forgiveness. But the beginning of accountability. Her next visit was to Jason. This was harder. He had always been a quiet observer in her life, a source of calm in chaotic moments. But this time, his calm was cold. He had watched her fall into Drew's influence with eyes wide open. Had watched her turn her back on Michael, on truth, and on herself. Willow didn't ask for his sympathy, only his clarity. "I need to know what Drew's capable of," she said. And Jason, in his usual understated way, replied, "He's capable of anything when he thinks he's losing." That sentence stayed with her. It haunted her. Because she realized she hadn't seen the last of Drew, only the beginning of his unraveling. Meanwhile, Drew Kane was losing grip. The revelations had sparked investigations, financial audits, internal reviews, and legal inquiries into his dealings at Aurora and the courthouse. His calm demeanor, once the armor he wore in public, began to crack. Rumors swirled that he had falsified documents, manipulated custody recommendations, and used Nina Reeves' influence to discredit Michael's parental rights. Now, with Nina backing away and Willow stepping into the light, Drew found himself isolated, exposed, and increasingly desperate. He tried to spin the narrative, painting himself as a victim of betrayal. Even leaking stories to local press sources about being framed. But no one was buying it anymore. The tide had turned. And then came the final blow, not from the media or the courts, but from Willow herself. She filed a formal statement with the family court, withdrawing her past claims against Michael and citing emotional coercion under false pretenses as the reason for her original testimony. It was a legal earthquake. The case that once painted Michael as a negligent father was now unraveling, the credibility of the entire suit collapsing under the weight of Drew's manipulation. Within hours, Michael's legal team filed for a reversal, seeking to re-establish his full custody rights. And Willow, standing beside him in the courthouse hallway, looked the judge in the eye and said, "I want what's best for my children. And that starts with the truth." News of the courtroom reversal spread like wildfire. For Drew, it was a death sentence. Not literal, though some whispered about his growing paranoia and erratic behavior, but political, financial, and personal. His allies disappeared. Aurora's board called an emergency meeting. His legal counsel walked out. Even his oldest friends, those who once vouched for his character, went silent. Drew, who had spent months shaping himself into a paragon of strength and leadership, now stood at the center of a storm of his own making, stripped of credibility, respect, and influence. And yet, in the ashes of Drew's collapse, something extraordinary was happening. Willow was not only reclaiming her life, she was transforming it. Her presence in Port Charles became stronger, more decisive. She took a seat on the hospital's ethics committee. She began volunteering at a local outreach program for women recovering from emotional abuse. She reconnected with Brooke Lynn and even had a long, honest conversation with Sasha about their respective journeys through trauma, motherhood, and resilience. Every step she took was deliberate, not to erase the past, but to build something stronger from it. And through it all, there was Michael. Their interactions began quietly. Drop-offs with the children. Calendar updates. Small conversations about school lunches and bedtime routines. But there was a tenderness in Michael's voice again, not trust, not yet, but curiosity. And Willow felt it too. That strange gravitational pull they had once shared. One night, after an event at Wiley's school, Willow lingered in the driveway a moment too long. Michael noticed. He walked out. Asked if she was okay. She nodded, then said softly, "I never thanked you for not slamming the door in my face when I showed up." Michael, thoughtful as always, replied, "I was too busy hoping you'd walk through it." That night didn't end with a kiss or a promise. But it ended with something more important, possibility. As Drew faced depositions, subpoenas, and public disgrace, Willow faced redemption. She no longer needed to plead for Michael's love, she had earned back his respect. And in a world as unforgiving as Port Charles, that was no small miracle. With each passing day, the children sensed the peace returning. Wiley laughed more. Amelia clung to her mother with the kind of trust that cannot be faked. And Michael, guarded but hopeful, began to believe again in the idea of family. The story was no longer about Drew's betrayal. It was about Willow's transformation. Her shift from pawn to protector. From victim to voice. And while the road ahead would still be marked by shadows of the past, the light was beginning to shine through. Not because someone else saved her, but because she saved herself. And in the city of endless lies and buried truths, that was the most explosive revelation of all. The reunion didn't come with a grand declaration or a romantic crescendo. There was no music swelling in the background, no thunderstorm breaking over the Corinthos estate. Instead, it came quietly, in fragments, in glances, in the way Willow and Michael began to stand closer to each other without noticing, the way their conversations lasted longer. And the silences between them became comfortable rather than strained. It was a soft unraveling of distance, a slow reweaving of threads once torn apart by betrayal, grief, and manipulation. But despite the quiet nature of their reunion, it carried the weight of something monumental, something that spoke not only to their love, but to the very future of their family. Willow and Michael had been through the fire. Together and apart. And now, as the ashes settled and the truth of Drew's betrayal stood fully exposed, they were no longer the people they once were. The illusions had been burned away. What remained was something raw, honest, and profoundly changed. Michael, who had once closed the door on Willow to shield his children from further pain, now opened it willingly, not out of blind hope, but because he saw in her the strength she had been too afraid to show before. Willow, once lost in a fog of denial and dependence, had found her way back, not to the version of herself Michael once loved, but to a new self, independent, clear-eyed, unafraid. Their reunion marked the beginning of a different kind of love story, one forged from survival, redefined by maturity, and grounded in the fierce devotion they both had for Wiley and Amelia. The children, who had unknowingly borne the weight of their parents' collapse, were the quiet heartbeat of this renewal. Wiley had grown more withdrawn during the months of chaos, often clinging to Michael with wide, confused eyes, sensing the tension even when no words were spoken. Amelia, still too young to understand, mirrored Willow's emotions with uncanny intuition, growing restless during her mother's spiraling and finally peaceful once Willow recentered herself. Now, with their parents beginning to reunite, the children responded with a joy too pure to fake. Wiley began to laugh more, ask questions again, draw pictures of all four of them, pictures with sunshine and hearts. Not jagged lines and broken shapes. But beneath the surface, not everything was simple. The past didn't disappear just because love returned. Both Willow and Michael were still haunted, not only by what had been lost, but by what might still go wrong. Willow's fear was more than guilt. It was obsession. She checked on the children constantly, watched them sleep longer than necessary, grew tense when anyone else held them for too long. The trauma of almost losing them, emotionally, legally, had carved a deep wound in her, one that bled quietly even as she smiled during family dinners. Michael noticed, of course. He always had. He saw the way her hands trembled when Amelia cried too loudly, how she froze when Wiley mentioned Drew's name. And though he said nothing at first, he began to gently pull her closer when the anxiety spiked, a hand on her back, a soft murmur in her ear, anchoring her with his presence. Willow, for her part, began to see the weight Michael had carried alone. She hadn't realized, not fully, how hard he had fought to protect their children while she stood beside the man who nearly tore them apart. She saw it in the dark circles under his eyes, in the guarded way he still spoke to lawyers and school staff, as if expecting the next betrayal. Their reunion didn't erase the scars. It simply allowed them to be seen. And being seen, fully, painfully, honestly, was the most intimate act either of them had experienced in a long time. Together, they began building a new rhythm. Shared parenting. Shared decisions. Nights with books and lullabies. Mornings with spilled cereal and sleepy laughter. They started therapy, together and separately, not just for themselves, but to give Wiley and Amelia the parents they deserved. They restructured their lives around honesty, around transparency. Willow even spoke publicly at the hospital about her journey. About emotional abuse, about the invisible chains of coercion. Her words resonated deeply across Port Charles, especially with other women who had silently endured similar paths. Michael stood beside her at every step, not as her savior, but as her equal. But not everyone welcomed the reunion. Some still whispered in corners about the damage Willow had caused. Others questioned how quickly Michael forgave. Even Carly, fiercely loyal to her son, struggled with the idea of opening her heart again to the woman who once sided with Drew. Jason, ever the quiet protector, kept a watchful eye, not on Willow, but on the shadows still circling Drew's name. And Sasha, gracious and poised, continued to offer silent support. Even as she stepped away from the emotional space Michael and Willow were beginning to reclaim. It wasn't resentment. It was respect. Meanwhile, Drew's collapse became complete. Legal action intensified. Former allies flipped. A scandal at Aurora forced a federal investigation. Nina was subpoenaed. Bank accounts were frozen. Assets seized. He tried to disappear but was arrested trying to leave the state. The once proud ex-soldier was now a cautionary tale, a man who used trust as a weapon and lost everything when the truth emerged. Michael and Willow didn't celebrate his downfall. But they did acknowledge it as a turning point. A moment when the past finally stopped chasing them. For Wiley and Amelia, the future was still unfolding, but the foundations were strong again. Willow and Michael began planning a family trip, something simple, something joyful. Just the four of them. Away from the gossip, away from the courtroom, away from the ghosts. They bought a small cottage near Lake Ontario. Nothing extravagant, just quiet. Safe. Whole. And one evening, as the sun dipped below the water and Amelia dozed in Willow's arms while Wiley roasted marshmallows with Michael, Willow whispered the words that had been forming for weeks. I want to come home. Not just physically. Emotionally. Permanently. Michael, eyes soft with everything he never thought he'd feel again, didn't answer with words. He took her hand, kissed her knuckles, and nodded. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It wasn't perfection. But it was love. Real love. Born from fire, shaped by loss, made stronger by truth. And so, under the stars and the gentle rhythm of their children's laughter, Willow and Michael stepped into the future, not as the couple they used to be, but as the family they had fought to become. And for the first time in a long time, Port Charles watched not a tragedy unfold, but a resurrection. A second chance. A legacy rewritten. Because some love stories don't begin with sparks, they begin with ashes.